Hello, students. Last week, we started talking about kitchen tools and cooking terms. We are getting ready to prepare ourselves as soon as you come back next week to be able to start kitchen safety. But I want to go ahead and go through the kitchen basics with you and review some of the items that you might have learned previously in maybe culinary arts or in the Intro to Human Studies class. But I want to go over these things with you just to make sure that we know the basics of the kitchen before we actually start getting in the kitchen and doing labs. So if you will, go ahead and get out a sheet of notebook paper. Okay. On that notebook paper, you're going to need to put your name, date, and class period in the top right-hand corner. And you're going to want to label these notes for today reading recipe notes. Make sure that you do take your notes because you will have to upload a picture of them as proof that you listened to the lecture. So if you need to pause for a moment and get a piece of paper and a pencil ready, and then click play when you are ready to begin your notes. Most cooks or people who are going to work in a kitchen are going to use recipes. Now, what is a recipe? A recipe is a list of ingredients that gives you directions for preparing a specific food. Make sure you write that definition down. Now, if you know how to follow a recipe, then you can be successful in the kitchen. Okay, who knows? If you can read a recipe, you can become a famous chef, but you have to know how to follow instructions in the kitchen to create a dish that is enjoyable. Now, once you get to be somewhat of an expert at reading recipes, then you can start to create your own because you know about ratios and about how much things should be to equal each other out. But when you're first beginning to cook, you really need to stick to recipes. People have been cooking since the beginning of time. Okay. Now, before people could read and write, recipes were passed down by word of mouth. Okay, so they were family recipes that were passed down from generation to generation. Now, measurements during these times were not exact. Okay, so they might say a pinch of this, a dab of this, a dab of that, a shake of this. Okay, but there were also no standard measuring cups or spoons. So depending on the cook and how much experience a cook or a chef had would be the basis of how their recipes would turn out. So this led to the creation of something called standardized. Let's look at an example of a recipe that would have been probably passed down from generation to generation. So this recipe, the title of it is Quick Pudding, and the directions say, beat up 4 eggs, add a pint of milk and a little salt, and stir in 4 large spoonfuls of flour and a little nutmeg and sugar to taste. Beat it well and pour into buttered teacups, filling them half full. They will bake in a stove or Dutch oven for 15 minutes. So when we look at this recipe, there are a lot of questions that can come up if you're trying to prepare it. So we know to beat up 4 eggs, okay, we know what that means. Pint of milk is a measurement, okay, salt, and then stir in 4 large spoonfuls of flour. What kind of spoon are they talking about? Are they talking about the spoon that we eat cereal with? Are they talking about the spoon that we get for the baking? Are we talking about the serving spoons that are a little bit bigger? Okay, so depending on how much flour you put in there, it can make a big difference in the taste of this recipe. And then it says pour into buttered teacups. Are we talking about the china teacups that are really nice in the cabinet? Can we put those in the oven? If so, we put them bake on the stove. Well, what kind of stove are we talking about? Are we doing it on the stove top? Are we doing it in an oven? What's a Dutch oven? Okay, how high does the heat need to be? Okay, all of these are questions that we don't necessarily know that could affect the outcome of our recipe. So if we're wanting to make it just like Grandma used to make, and she wrote this down, odds are we might get a different result, and it might not taste just like Grandma's quick pudding. Because of the recipe we saw previously, this led to the standardization of recipes. The process of standardization means that each item will be the same. So no matter if different cooks will fix the same recipe, it's going to look and taste the same time it is served. Standardization of recipes is very important in chain restaurants, okay? So if you go to an Olive Garden in Jackson, you're going to expect the same thing if you go to an Olive Garden in Memphis or in another state. Okay? It is very important for customer service and customer expectations. However, the standardization of recipes can hinder chefs and employees to be creative in a professional kitchen. But if for chain restaurants and restaurants who have more than one locations, standardized recipes are going to be very, very important. There are two styles of recipe formats that you will find today. The first one of those styles is known as the standard format. Now, the standard format is going to list ingredients in order of use. It's going to provide you with step-by-step directions, usually listed in 1, 2, 3, 4 order or number order. And the standard format is going to be the most common format that you're going to find on a recipe. Then you have a narrative format. This is a recipe that's going to be written in paragraph form. Okay. Now, a lot of times if someone is handing down a recipe by word of mouth or something that they have created, it can be in a narrative format, okay? And they're going to use things like first, then, next, last. And it is not as common as the standard recipe format, but it is usually done when space is limited. So if you have a recipe that's maybe in a small space of a package on a box or on a can, a lot of times it will be written in narrative form, but these are usually very, very simple recipes. A recipe is basically a formula, and it is very, very important to read the entire recipe before you begin cooking. You never want to start getting out your ingredients, cutting them up, and working as you go, then to discover that you might not have what you need to begin the recipe. So the parts of the recipe will tell you the name, the ingredients, the equipment that you'll need, your directions, the time and temperature, the yield, and sometimes it will give you the nutritional analysis, which is a food label. Alright, now let's look at the parts of a recipe. You're going to want to write down everything that is in the pink boxes. I know it's not yellow. I couldn't get my PowerPoint to change those specific colors. So make sure that you go ahead and label parts of the recipe, and then go ahead and number your paper. So this would be 1, this would be 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so number 1, the first part of a recipe is going to be the name, and that is what the recipe is actually called. In this example recipe, quesadillas is the name of the recipe. Okay. The second thing that you're going to see is something called the yield. This is the number of servings a recipe makes. Most all recipes, or a good recipe, should give you the yield to tell you how many people it will serve. So the yield, if you make this quesadilla according to this recipe, you will have four people to be able to serve, 2 per person. Okay, so that's the number of servings the recipe makes. The third is going to be the equipment. The equipment is typically going to be found together with the directions or method. So if you notice on the directions steps, okay, it will say place a tortilla in the pan. So we know that you're going to need a pan or a skillet as part of your equipment. Okay. Number 4 is the directions or methods. These are the steps that you will follow to make a recipe. You always start with step number 1 and go down. Okay. You will also find the ingredients. The ingredients are the food products that you will need to make the recipe. Again, it is extremely important that you read the entire recipe before you begin to actually cook or prepare your recipe. Just like we discussed before, a good recipe has several parts. The first 2 are a list of ingredients with the amounts required and the directions for mixing up the ingredients. Those are the 2 main components of a good recipe. Other elements of a good recipe include having ingredients listed in order of their use, the exact measurement amounts of each ingredient, and simple step-by-step directions listed in sequence. Cooking time, cooking temperature, the size of correct cooking equipment, the number and serving sizes, and the recipe that is a tested one are all examples of a good recipe. So make sure that it has an amount of time for whatever it is to cook, a temperature such as 350, medium high heat, etc. When you're making brownies, correct size of equipment, they might say a 9 by 13 baking dish or an 8 by 8. And make sure that your recipe is a tested one. If you get a recipe off the internet, please make sure that you look at the reviews to see how people have tested the recipe to make sure that it is valid. Home recipes or recipes for the home cook can be very different from professional recipes. Professional recipes for such as caterers or for anyone who is in the culinary world or restaurant world, their recipes may be very different. They may be in very, very large quantities. They may be written by weight or in the metric system, so liters instead of gallons. The instructions may be called a method, and they may also include specific plating instructions. However, in traditional recipes, that is typically not the case because they are not serving such large quantities. Your assignment for today is to find the following worksheet in Microsoft Teams under Assignments. You may go ahead and type on the worksheet and make sure you click Turn In when finished. Last but not least, here is an extra credit opportunity for you. If you would like to earn extra credit, you will want to find a recipe and then you will want to identify and label each part of that recipe. Okay, once you have found the recipe, labeled it, then you will need to answer 2 questions. What special equipment is needed to prepare this recipe? And then I want you to list 3 cooking terms and identify them and then explain them. So if you will do that, that will be worth 15 extra credit points.